The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and amber, but Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez couldn't appreciate the beauty. Her fingers gripped the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as she flew low through the valley, scanning the rocky terrain below. The radio crackled with urgent voices from base, and her heart pounded with each transmission. "Phoenix, this is Overlord Base. We have confirmation on Slate 12's position. Grid coordinates coming through now." Sarah adjusted her headset and glanced at her navigation display. Slate 12 was the code name for a special forces team that had been missing for 3 days. Intelligence suggested they were trapped in a cave system, surrounded by enemy fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere. The rescue mission had already been delayed twice due to bad weather and increased enemy activity in the area. "Copy that, Overlord. Phoenix receiving coordinates now." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. She had flown dozens of close air support missions, but something felt different about this one. The mountains seemed more hostile today, the shadows deeper and more threatening. Her wingman, Lieutenant Jake Viper Thompson, flew beside her in his own A-10. They had trained together for 2 years, and Sarah trusted him completely. His aircraft looked like a gray ghost against the morning sky, its distinctive straight wings and twin engines designed for one purpose: delivering devastating firepower to protect ground troops. "Phoenix, you seeing anything down there?" Viper's voice came through the radio, calm but alert. Sarah squinted at the terrain below. The valley was a maze of rocky outcroppings, dried riverbeds, and sparse vegetation. Perfect hiding spots for enemy fighters. Negative on visual contact. "But I don't like how quiet it is down there." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever. In her experience, quiet valleys in Afghanistan usually meant trouble. The enemy had learned to hide, to wait, and to strike when least expected. They used the terrain like a weapon, appearing and disappearing like phantoms in the ancient landscape. "Overlord, this is Phoenix. What's the latest on Slate 12's condition?" Sarah needed more information. The initial reports had been fragmentary at best. "Phoenix, Slate 12 consists of 4 operators. They've been radio silent for 18 hours. Last transmission indicated they were under heavy fire and low on ammunition. Medical status unknown." The voice from base carried a weight that Sarah recognized immediately. These weren't just numbers on a mission board. They were real people with families waiting for them to come home. Sarah thought about her own family back in Texas. Her younger brother had joined the Marines last year, inspired by her stories of military service. Her parents worried constantly, calling every week to make sure she was safe. She always told them not to worry, that she was careful, that she followed protocols. But the truth was more complicated. In combat, careful only went so far. "Roger that, Overlord. We'll find them." Sarah meant every word. No one gets left behind. It was more than a motto. It was a sacred promise that bound every member of the military together. The A-10 was built for missions like this. Its thick armor could withstand small arms fire and even some anti-aircraft weapons. The massive Gu-8 cannon mounted in its nose could destroy tanks and fortified positions. But most importantly, it could fly low and slow, giving pilots the time and visibility they needed to distinguish between friend and foe in complex ground situations. As they flew deeper into the valley, Sarah noticed movement on a ridge to the east. She adjusted her flight path slightly and activated her targeting systems. "Viper, I've got possible movement on the eastern ridge. Can you confirm?" "Checking now, Phoenix." Viper banked his aircraft to get a better angle. "Confirmed. Looks like 3 individuals with weapons. They're trying to stay hidden behind those rocks." Sarah felt her training take over. Identify the threat, assess the situation, protect friendly forces. But in the complex environment of Afghanistan, these steps weren't always straightforward. The enemy often used civilians as human shields, and rules of engagement required positive identification before engaging targets. Overlord, Phoenix requesting permission to investigate possible hostile contacts on Eastern Ridge, grid reference following. Sarah rattled off the coordinates while keeping her eyes on the suspicious movement below. Phoenix, you are cleared to investigate. Slate 12's last known position is approximately 2 kilometers south of your current location. Be advised, friendly rescue team is en route to your area. Call sign Dustoff 7, ETA 15 minutes. The mention of the rescue helicopter added another layer of complexity to the mission. Dustoff 7 would be a medevac bird, likely a Black Hawk with minimal armor and defensive capabilities. Sarah and Viper would need to secure the area before the helicopter arrived, ensuring it could land safely and extract the Special Forces team. Copy, Overlord. Phoenix and Viper will clear the area for Dustoff 7. Sarah switched to her wingman's frequency. Viper, let's take a closer look at those contacts. I'll go high, you stay low. Watch for anti-aircraft weapons. Roger, Phoenix. Going in for a closer look. Sarah climbed to a higher altitude while Viper descended toward the ridge. This was standard tactical procedure. One aircraft draws attention while the other maintains overwatch. If the enemy revealed anti-aircraft positions by firing at Viper, Sarah would be in position to eliminate the threat. The landscape below seemed to pulse with hidden danger. Every shadow could conceal an enemy fighter, every rocky outcropping a potential ambush site. Sarah had learned to read the terrain like a map, looking for the subtle signs that revealed human presence. Disturbed earth, unnatural color variations, geometric shapes that didn't belong in nature. Phoenix, Viper here. I'm getting a better look at those contacts. They appear to be carrying AK-47s and have what looks like radio equipment. No visible anti-aircraft weapons, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Sarah processed this information quickly. Enemy fighters with radios meant they were likely part of a larger coordinated force. They would be reporting the presence of American aircraft to their commanders, who might be positioning heavier weapons even now. Viper, maintain observation, but stay at safe distance. We need to locate Slate 12 before engaging anyone. Sarah made the decision based on mission priorities. Rescuing friendly forces took precedence over eliminating enemy contacts, unless those contacts posed an immediate threat to the rescue operation. As they continued their search pattern, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart skip a beat. In a small clearing about 3 kilometers ahead, she could see what looked like signal panels arranged in a pattern she recognized. It was a standard military distress signal, used by special forces when they needed immediate assistance. Viper, I think I've found them. Check grid reference 4-1-7-9-2-8. Do you see those panels? Confirmed, Phoenix. That's definitely a friendly signal. But I'm also seeing movement in the surrounding hills. Looks like they're surrounded. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat situations. The Special Forces team was alive and signaling, but they were clearly in immediate danger. The rescue helicopter would be arriving soon, but landing in a hot zone surrounded by enemy fighters would be suicide. Overlord, Phoenix here. We have visual contact with Slate 12. They're alive and signaling, but the landing zone is not secure. Multiple hostile contacts in surrounding terrain, requesting immediate clearance to engage. The radio silence that followed seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Sarah knew that back at base, commanders were weighing the risks, considering rules of engagement, and making calculations that would determine whether everyone made it home alive. Phoenix, Overlord, you're cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared to engage hostile forces threatening Slate 12. Dustoff 7 is holding its safe distance until area is secure. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief because she could now act to help the trapped soldiers. Apprehension because the next few minutes would be among the most dangerous of her military career. Close air support in mountainous terrain required precision, courage, and a little bit of luck. Viper, you heard Overlord. Let's clear a path for our guys. Sarah armed her weapons systems and began her attack run. The A-10's cannon held 1,350 rounds of 30 mm ammunition, each round capable of destroying vehicles and fortified positions. But in this situation, precision was more important than raw firepower. As Sarah dove toward the first group of enemy fighters, she could see muzzle flashes from their weapons. They were firing at the trapped Special Forces team, who were returning fire from behind hastily constructed defensive positions. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls, creating a chaotic symphony of violence that spoke to the desperation of the situation. Phoenix, beginning attack run on Eastern Ridge contacts. Sarah lined up her shot, adjusting for wind and the movement of targets below. At this altitude, she could see individual figures scrambling for cover among the rocks. Some appeared to be carrying heavier weapons, possibly rocket-propelled grenades that could threaten both the trapped soldiers and the incoming rescue helicopter. The first burst from her cannon sent a line of explosions across the ridge, sending debris and dust high into the air. Sarah pulled up from her dive and banked hard to the right, already planning her next attack. Below, she could see that her fire had been effective. Several of the enemy positions had been destroyed, and the remaining fighters were scrambling to new locations. "Good hits, Phoenix," Viper called out as he began his own attack run on a different group of targets. "I'm engaging contacts on the southern slope." Sarah circled back for another pass, but something caught her attention in her peripheral vision. A glint of sunlight reflecting off metal, high on a ridge to the north. Her training and instincts immediately recognized the threat. Someone was tracking aircraft movements with what appeared to be a targeting device. "Viper, break left now. Possible SAM site on northern ridge." The warning came just as Sarah saw the telltale smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile launching from the hidden position. The missile was tracking Viper's aircraft, its guidance system locked onto his heat signature. In that instant, Sarah faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could continue her attack on the enemy fighters surrounding Slate 12, clearing the way for the rescue helicopter and potentially saving 4 lives. Or she could sacrifice her mission to save her wingman's life, knowing that this decision might doom the trapped Special Forces team to death or capture. But for Sarah Martinez, it wasn't really a choice at all. The brotherhood of military service meant that you protected your fellow warriors, regardless of the cost. Without hesitation, she banked her A-10 toward the incoming missile, placing her aircraft between the weapon and Viper's plane. "Phoenix, what are you doing?" Viper's voice carried a note of panic as he realized what was happening. "Saving your life, you idiot. Now get clear and complete the mission." Sarah's voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as she committed to a course of action that she knew would likely cost her everything. The missile was designed to home in on heat signatures, and Sarah's A-10 was now a much larger and more attractive target than Viper's aircraft. She watched the weapon adjust its course toward her, its guidance fins making minute corrections as it closed the distance. In her headset, she could hear Viper calling her name, begging her to break off and save herself. Instead, Sarah thought about the 4 soldiers trapped below, about her brother who looked up to her, about all the people who were counting on warriors like her to make the hard choices. She thought about her parents, who had raised her to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is sacrifice. The missile struck her aircraft just behind the cockpit, and Sarah felt the world explode around her in a maelstrom of fire and twisted metal. The explosion that consumed Captain Sarah Martinez's A-10 sent shockwaves through the mountain valley, but Lieutenant Jake Thompson had no time to mourn his wingman's sacrifice. The smoking wreckage of Phoenix's aircraft tumbled down the mountainside in a cascade of burning metal and debris, while the surface-to-air missile site that had fired the fatal shot was already reloading for another strike. "Phoenix! Phoenix, respond!" Jake's voice cracked over the radio, though he knew in his heart that no response would come. He had watched the missile hit her aircraft directly, had seen the fireball engulf the cockpit area where his friend and fellow pilot had been sitting just moments before. The woman who had saved his life was gone, and Now the weight of completing their mission fell entirely on his shoulders. Viper, this is Overlord. What's your status? The voice from base was tense, professional, but Jake could hear the underlying concern. They had monitored the entire exchange and knew they had just lost one of their best pilots. Jake forced himself to focus on the immediate tactical situation. Below him, the 4 members of Slate 12 were still trapped and under fire from multiple enemy positions. The rescue helicopter, Dustoff 7, was circling at a safe distance, waiting for clearance to attempt the extraction. And somewhere on the northern ridge, enemy fighters were preparing to fire another missile at any aircraft that came within range. Overlord, Viper here. Phoenix is down. I repeat, Phoenix is down. The words felt like broken glass in his throat. But the mission continues. Slate 12 is still in need of immediate extraction, and I have multiple hostile contacts engaging their position. Jake banked his A-10 toward the enemy positions that Phoenix had been attacking when the missile struck. Her sacrifice had to mean something. The Special Forces team below was counting on him now, and he would not let them down. He would not let her sacrifice be in vain. As he lined up for his attack run, Jake could see the enemy fighters more clearly. They had taken advantage of the confusion following Phoenix's crash to advance on Slate 12's position. Some were using the rocky terrain to move closer, while others were providing covering fire from elevated positions. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dustoff 7, this is Viper. I need 5 more minutes to clear the LZ. Stay at your current position until I give the all clear. Jake armed his weapons systems and began his dive toward the first group of targets. Roger, Viper. Dustoff 7 standing by. We're ready to go in hot, if necessary. Jake appreciated the helicopter crew's willingness to risk their lives, but a medevac bird flying into an active combat zone was essentially a flying coffin. The Black Hawk had minimal armor and no significant offensive weapons. It relied entirely on other aircraft to provide protection during dangerous extractions. The first burst from Jake's Gu-8 cannon tore through a cluster of enemy fighters who had been advancing down a narrow ravine towards Slate 12's position. The 30mm round struck the rocky walls and sent deadly fragments bouncing in all directions. Jake could see several figures go down, while others scrambled for better cover. Good hits, Viper. The voice came from one of the Slate 12 operators on the ground. You got at least 4 of them, but there are more coming from the west. We're running low on ammunition down here. Jake acknowledged the transmission and immediately adjusted his flight path to engage the western approach routes. As he turned, he caught sight of Phoenix's crash site on a distant slope. Smoke was still rising from the wreckage, and he found himself wondering if she had survived the impact. The A-10 was built to be tough, designed to bring pilots home even after taking significant damage. But no aircraft could survive a direct missile hit to the cockpit area. Focus on the mission, Jake told himself, using the same words Phoenix had spoken during their training exercises. Complete the mission, then mourn the dead. He dove toward the western ridge, where enemy fighters were attempting to flank Slate 12's position. These appeared to be better organized than the first group, using military tactics and moving with purpose. As Jake approached, several of them turned their weapons toward his aircraft, sending trails of tracer rounds into the sky around him. The A-10 shrugged off the small arms fire like an armored knight, ignoring arrows. Its titanium bathtub around the cockpit and critical systems could withstand hits from weapons up to 23mm. But Jake knew that larger anti-aircraft weapons could still bring him down, and he kept his eyes scanning for the telltale signs of heavier enemy systems. His second strafing run scattered the Western Assault Group, buying precious time for the trapped Special Forces team. But as he pulled up from his attack, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. More enemy fighters were emerging from concealed positions throughout the valley. What had initially appeared to be a small ambush was revealing itself to be a much larger and more coordinated trap. Overlord, Viper here. I'm counting at least 30 enemy combatants in the immediate area, possibly more. This looks like a planned ambush. Slate May 12th have been deliberately led into this position. The implications of this realization were staggering. If the enemy had planned this ambush specifically to trap a Special Forces team, they would have prepared accordingly. That meant heavier weapons, more personnel, and probably additional surface-to-air missile sites that hadn't revealed themselves yet. Copy Viper. Intelligence is analyzing the situation. Continue with extraction operations. Reinforcements are en route, but ETA is 45 minutes. 45 minutes might as well have been 45 hours. Slate 12 wouldn't last that long against the forces arrayed against them, and Jake couldn't stay in the air indefinitely. His fuel was already running lower than he would like, and ammunition was a finite resource. Dustoff 7, what's your fuel status? Jake needed to know how long the rescue helicopter could wait. Viper, Dustoff 7. We've got about 30 minutes of station time before we need to return to base for fuel. After that, it'll be at least an hour before we can return to the area. An hour delay would mean certain death for the trapped soldiers. Jake made a command decision that would have made Phoenix proud. Dustoff 7, I'm going to clear you a corridor for immediate extraction. Be ready to move fast and get out faster. Roger, Viper. Dustoff 7 is ready. Jake began the most intense and dangerous flying of his military career. For the next 10 minutes, he flew a continuous pattern around Slate 12's position, engaging any enemy fighters that tried to advance on the trap team. His cannon rounds chewed through rocky defensive positions, sending enemy combatants scrambling for new cover or eliminating them entirely. But as he flew, Jake became increasingly aware that he was being watched and tracked. Several times, he caught glimpses of sunlight reflecting off optical equipment on distant ridges. The enemy was studying his flight patterns, learning his tactics, and probably positioning weapons to bring him down. Slate 12, this is Viper. I'm going to suppress the northern ridge, then bring Dustoff 7 straight in from the south. Be ready to move to the extraction point on my mark. Copy, Viper. Slate 12 is ready. And Viper, thank you. We know what Phoenix did for all of us. Jake felt a tightness in his chest at the mention of his wingman's name. Phoenix had given her life to save him, and now he was risking his life to save others. It was the nature of military service, an endless chain of sacrifice and brotherhood that bound warriors together across time and space. As Jake began his attack on the northern ridge, he spotted something that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden among the rocks was not just one surface-to-air missile launcher, but 3 of them. The enemy had been waiting for the rescue helicopter, planning to shoot it down along with any escorts when they attempted the extraction. Overlord, Viper here. I've got multiple SAM sites on the northern ridge. This whole thing was a trap designed to bag a rescue bird. Copy, Viper. How do you want to proceed? Jake looked at his weapons display. He had enough cannon rounds for perhaps 2 more effective strafing runs, and no air-to-ground missiles remaining. Against 3 missile launchers and their supporting troops, the odds were not in his favor. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear Phoenix's voice reminding him that impossible odds were just another day at the office for A-10 pilots. Overlord, I'm going to take out those SAM sites. Once they're down, bring Dustoff 7 straight in for immediate extraction. No delays, no second chances. Viper, be advised you'll be flying directly into overlapping fields of fire. Recommend you abort and wait for reinforcements. Jake almost smiled at the suggestion. Phoenix had flown directly into a missile to save his life. The least he could do was return the favor for 4 soldiers who were counting on him. Negative, Overlord. Phoenix didn't wait for reinforcements, and neither will I. He dove toward the first missile site, knowing that the moment he opened fire, all 3 launchers would track his aircraft and fire simultaneously. The A-10 was tough, but no aircraft could survive 3 direct hits from surface-to-air missiles. This would be a one-way trip, just like Phoenix's had been. As Jake's cannon rounds began tearing into the first missile position, he saw the bright flashes of rocket motors igniting on the other two launchers. 3 missiles streaked toward his aircraft, their guidance systems locked onto his heat signature and radar cross-section. In that moment, Jake understood exactly what Phoenix had felt in her final seconds. A strange mixture of fear and peace, knowing that her sacrifice would save others. The first missile missed his aircraft by mere feet. Thrown off course by the violent maneuvering Jake was performing as he continued his attack run. The second missile struck his left engine, sending shrapnel through the wing and causing immediate engine failure. Warning lights flooded his cockpit as his A-10 began losing altitude and speed. But Jake kept firing, pouring everything he had into the missile positions below. His rounds found their mark on the second launcher, causing a massive secondary explosion as stored missiles detonated. The blast was so intense that it damaged the third launcher, rendering it temporarily inoperable. The third missile caught Jake's aircraft in the tail section, severing control cables and hydraulic lines. His A-10 began an uncontrolled spin toward the ground, and Jake knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before impact. But those 30 seconds were enough. Dust off 7, dust off 7. The corridor is clear. Get in there now. Through his spinning cockpit, Jake could see the rescue helicopter racing towards Slate 12's position at maximum speed. The pilot was flying like his life depended on it, which it did. Every second they remained in the area increased the chance that other enemy weapons would engage them. Jake's aircraft hit the mountain slope with tremendous force, cartwheeling through rocks and debris before coming to rest in a broken pile of twisted metal. But even as his consciousness faded, he could hear the sound of the rescue helicopter's rotors overhead, and he knew that Slate 12 would make it home. In the end, both A-10 pilots had given their lives to ensure that the rescue mission succeeded. Phoenix had sacrificed herself to save Viper, and Viper had sacrificed himself to save Slate 12. It was the kind of heroism that military families understood, but civilian populations rarely saw. Quiet, professional courage that put the lives of others before personal safety. The rescue helicopter successfully extracted all 4 members of Slate 12 and was racing back toward friendly airspace when reinforcements finally arrived in the area. By then, the valley was quiet except for the crackling of burning aircraft and the whisper of wind through the ancient mountains. Staff Sergeant Marcus Bear Rodriguez had been unconscious when a rescue helicopter pulled him from the rocky defensive position where Slate 12 had made their last stand. The explosion from Lieutenant Thompson's final attack on the missile sites had sent shockwaves through the valley, and a falling piece of shrapnel had caught him in the head just as the helicopter was landing. Now, 3 days later, he was waking up in a military hospital in Germany, trying to piece together the fragments of memory from what had become the longest 72 hours of his life. The first thing Marcus noticed was the silence. For 3 days and nights, his world had been filled with the constant crack of gunfire, the whistle of incoming rounds, and the desperate radio chatter of soldiers fighting for their lives. The absence of those sounds felt almost as disorienting as their presence had been terrifying. The second thing he noticed was that he was alone in his hospital room, which meant his teammates were either dead or being treated elsewhere. "Sergeant Rodriguez?" A soft voice spoke from the doorway. Marcus turned his head carefully, wincing at the pain from his bandaged skull, and saw a young nurse approaching his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Marcus replied, his voice rough from dehydration and the breathing tube they had removed earlier that morning. "My team, are they?" "Your teammates are all alive, Sergeant." Sergeant Williams is 2 rooms down with a broken leg and some shrapnel wounds. Corporal Jackson is in surgery, but the doctors expect a full recovery. And Specialist Sean is being treated for severe dehydration and exhaustion, but he'll be fine. Relief flooded through Marcus like a physical force. For 3 days, he had been certain that some or all of his men would die in that valley. The thought of facing their families, of explaining how he had failed to bring everyone home, had been a constant weight on his shoulders. Now, knowing that all 4 members of Slate 12 had survived, He felt like he could finally breathe again. "Sergeant, there are some people here who need to speak with you when you're ready," the nurse continued gently. "Debriefing officers and some families of the pilots who saved you." The mention of the pilots brought everything rushing back. Marcus remembered the sound of the A-10s overhead, the devastating firepower they had brought to bear on the enemy positions surrounding his team. He remembered hearing one of the pilots call sign Phoenix, reporting that she was taking missile fire. And then he remembered the explosion, the sound of aircraft crashing into the mountainside, and the terrible realization that people had died to save his life. "How many?" Marcus asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would break his heart. "Both pilots gave their lives to ensure your rescue, Sergeant. Captain Sarah Martinez and Lieutenant Jake Thompson. Their sacrifice saved your entire team and the helicopter crew that extracted you." Marcus closed his eyes and felt tears beginning to form. In his 15 years of military service, he had lost friends before. It was an inevitable part of being a professional soldier. But this felt different. These pilots had deliberately chosen death to save his life and the lives of his teammates. That level of sacrifice created a debt that could never be repaid. "I need to see their families," Marcus said after a long moment. "I need to tell them what their children did." The nurse nodded understandingly. "Captain Martinez's parents and brother are here. Lieutenant Thompson's wife and daughter flew in yesterday. They've been waiting to speak with you, but the doctors wanted to make sure you were stable first." Marcus struggled to sit up in his hospital bed, ignoring the protests from his injured body. Some conversations were too important to have while lying down. "Can you ask them to come in?" All of them together. They need to hear this as a group. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself facing a small group of people whose lives had been forever changed by the events in that Afghan valley. Captain Martinez's parents, Robert and Elena, sat holding hands tightly, their faces showing the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from grieving a child. Her younger brother, David, still wore his Marine dress blue uniform, having flown directly from his base in California to be here. Lieutenant Thompson's wife, Jessica, held their 4-year-old daughter, Emma, on her lap. The little girl didn't fully understand why everyone was so sad, but she sensed the gravity of the situation and remained unusually quiet. Jessica's eyes were red from crying, but she managed to maintain her composure as she waited to hear what the man her husband had died to save had to say. "I don't know how to start this conversation," Marcus began, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words that can adequately express what your family members did for me and my teammates. But I need you to know exactly what happened in that valley, because their story deserves to be told completely and truthfully." Marcus took a deep breath and began recounting the events that had led to Slate 12 being trapped in the mountain valley. He explained how his team had been tracking a high-value target, following intelligence that suggested a major terrorist leader was meeting with local commanders in the area. What they had walked into instead was a carefully planned ambush designed specifically to capture or kill American Special Forces operators. "Sarah, Captain Martinez, she and Lieutenant Thompson arrived just when we thought we were going to die," Marcus continued. "We had been under fire for almost 18 hours. We were out of food, low on water, and down to our last magazines of ammunition. The enemy had us surrounded, and they were moving in for the kill." Robert Martinez leaned forward slightly. "What was Sarah like in combat? We know she was a good pilot, but we never really understood what that meant in a real situation." Marcus smiled slightly, the first time his expression had lightened since beginning his story. "Sir, your daughter was the most professional and competent pilot I've ever worked with. She was calm under pressure, precise in her attacks, and completely focused on protecting ground troops. But more than that, she was brave in a way that goes beyond training or duty. She was brave in her soul." He went on to describe how Phoenix and Viper had systematically destroyed the enemy positions that had his team pinned down, how they had provided the covering fire that allowed Slate 12 to establish better defensive positions and call in the rescue helicopter. Marcus painted a picture of two pilots working in perfect coordination, each trusting the other completely as they flew through intense ground fire to save soldiers they had never met. When a missile site revealed itself by firing at Lieutenant Thompson, Captain Martinez didn't hesitate for even a second. Marcus said, his voice becoming quieter as he approached the most difficult part of his story. She immediately turned her aircraft toward the incoming missile, placing herself between the weapon and her wingman. She saved his life without thinking about her own safety. Jessica Thompson spoke for the first time since entering the room. That sounds like Jake. He always put others first, sometimes to his own detriment. I can see why he and Captain Martinez made such a good team. Marcus nodded. Ma'am, after Captain Martinez was hit, your husband had every reason to retreat and wait for backup. He was alone, facing overwhelming odds, and he had already lost his wingman. But he never even considered leaving us behind. He continued the attack, clearing the way for our extraction, even though he knew it would cost him his life. The room fell silent as Marcus finished his account. The weight of what these two pilots had done settled over their families like a heavy blanket. These weren't random acts of heroism born from split-second decisions. They were deliberate choices made by people who understood the consequences, but refused to abandon their fellow warriors. Emma Thompson, who had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Daddy saved people. Jessica hugged her daughter closer and nodded. Yes, sweetheart. Daddy saved some very important people. Like a superhero. Exactly like a superhero. David Martinez, who had been silent throughout Marcus's story, finally spoke. Sergeant, my sister always talked about the bond between military personnel. She said civilians couldn't really understand how deep that connection goes. After hearing your story, I think I'm beginning to understand what she meant. Marcus looked at the young Marine, seeing so much of Phoenix in his determined expression and proud bearing. Your sister died believing that every American service member was worth any sacrifice necessary to bring them home safely. She lived that belief, and she died proving it. That's the kind of person we all aspire to be, but few of us actually achieve. Robert Martinez wiped his eyes and stood up slowly. Sergeant Rodriguez, you and your team were strangers to our daughter. You were just names on a mission briefing, people she had never met and might never see again. But she gave her life for you anyway. Can you help us understand why? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. It was one of the fundamental mysteries of military service. Why people willingly risk everything for strangers. He had pondered it many times during his own career, particularly during the darkest moments, when the easy thing would have been to put personal safety first. Sir, I think it comes down to trust. Marcus said finally. Every time we deploy, every time we go into harm's way, we trust that someone will come for us if we need help. We trust that we won't be abandoned, that our lives matter to the people who sent us into danger. Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Thompson honored that trust in the most complete way possible. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But there's something else too. Military service attracts people who believe in something bigger than themselves. People who understand that freedom and safety aren't free, that someone has to be willing to pay the price to protect the things we value. Your daughter and your husband were those kinds of people. Elena Martinez spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice barely above a whisper. We raised Sarah to be strong, to stand up for what's right. But we never imagined it would lead to this. Ma'am, Marcus said gently, the world is safer because people like your daughter choose to serve. The 4 men she saved will go on to have families, careers, and lives that wouldn't have been possible without her sacrifice. Those lives will touch other lives, and her impact will ripple outward in ways we can't even calculate. As the conversation continued, Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened in that valley. The media would eventually report on the incident, but they would focus on the tactical details. Aircraft lost, enemy casualties, mission objectives achieved or failed. They would miss the human story, the profound connections between people who had chosen to put others before themselves. The families began to share their own stories about Phoenix and Viper. Elena Martinez talked about how Sarah had always been protective of her younger brother, how she had taught him to stand up to bullies and defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Robert described his daughter's determination to become a pilot, how she had overcome every obstacle and exceeded every expectation to earn her place in one of the military's most demanding roles. Jessica Thompson shared memories of Jake's gentle nature, how he would spend hours reading bedtime stories to Emma, and how he had volunteered at a local animal shelter whenever he was home between deployments. She talked about his dreams of becoming a commercial pilot after military service, his plans to buy a small house in Colorado where Emma could grow up surrounded by mountains and clean air. As Marcus listened to these stories, he began to understand that Phoenix and Viper hadn't been superhuman warriors immune to fear or doubt. They had been ordinary people who had chosen to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. They had been sons and daughters, husband and father, people with hopes and dreams and fears just like everyone else. "There's something else you all need to know," Marcus said as the afternoon wore on. "This incident is going to be investigated thoroughly. There will be reports and hearings and probably some medal ceremonies. But I want you to know that from my perspective, as someone who was there, your family members died as heroes in the truest sense of the word." The conversation continued for several more hours as families shared memories, and Marcus provided details about the final moments of two remarkable pilots. As the day ended and visiting hours drew to a close, Marcus felt as though he had begun to repay a small portion of the enormous debt he owed to Phoenix and Viper. But he also knew that the real work of honoring their memory was just beginning. 6 months after the events in the Afghan Valley, the small town of Cedar Ridge, Texas, was preparing for a ceremony that would bring together families, military personnel, and community members to honor the sacrifice of two fallen heroes. The local American Legion post had worked tirelessly to organize a memorial service for Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez, whose parents still lived in the house where she had grown up dreaming of becoming a pilot. Marcus Rodriguez stood in his dress blue uniform, checking his appearance one final time in the mirror of his hotel room. The physical wounds from the rescue had healed completely, but the emotional impact of that day continued to shape every aspect of his life. He had retired from active duty 3 months earlier, unable to reconcile himself with the idea of continuing his military career when so many others had paid the ultimate price to save him. The decision to leave the Special Forces had not been easy. Marcus had spent 15 years perfecting his skills as a soldier, building a career based on precision, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to his teammates. But every time he looked at his equipment, every time he considered deploying again, he saw the faces of Phoenix and Viper and wondered if he was worthy of the sacrifice they had made. His therapist at the VA hospital had tried to help him understand that survivor's guilt was a normal response to trauma, that many soldiers struggled with similar feelings after losing comrades in combat. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two very different things. Marcus had saved lives during his military career, had completed dozens of successful missions, but none of that seemed to matter when measured against the debt he owed to two pilots he had known for less than 30 minutes. A knock on his hotel door interrupted his thoughts. "Sergeant Rodriguez? This is David Martinez. Are you ready?" Marcus opened the door to find Phoenix's younger brother waiting in the hallway, also dressed in his military uniform. David had completed his Marine Corps training and was now stationed at Camp Pendleton, carrying on the family tradition of military service despite the tragic loss of his sister. Over the past 6 months, he and Marcus had developed a friendship built on their shared understanding of military service and their mutual desire to honor Sarah's memory. "Ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, adjusting his tie one final time. "How are your parents holding up?" "They're doing better," David said as they walked toward the elevator. Having something concrete to focus on, like this memorial, has helped them process their grief. They've also been working with other military families who've lost children in combat. It gives them a sense of purpose. The memorial service was being held at Cedar Ridge High School, where Sarah Martinez had been the valedictorian of her graduating class before going on to the Air Force Academy. The gymnasium had been transformed into a shrine to her memory, with photographs spanning her life from childhood through her military career. Display cases contained her medals and commendations, while a large screen showed video testimonials from fellow pilots and ground troops who had served with her. As Marcus and David entered the gymnasium, they were struck by the number of people who had come to pay their respects. The entire community seemed to have turned out, along with representatives from air bases across the country and several dozen Special Forces personnel who had taken leave to attend the ceremony. Near the front of the room, Marcus could see Jessica Thompson holding her daughter Emma, who was wearing a small dress uniform in honor of her father. The ceremony began with a presentation of colors by an honor guard from nearby Randolph Air Force Base. As the American flag was posted and the national anthem played, Marcus found himself thinking about the meaning of the symbols and rituals that bound military families together. The flag represented the ideals that Phoenix and Viper had died defending, while the anthem reminded everyone present of the price that freedom required. General Patricia Hawkins, the commander of Air Combat Command, had flown in personally to speak at the memorial. As she approached the podium, her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. This was a woman who had flown combat missions herself, who understood firsthand the courage required to face death in defense of others. We gather today to honor two exceptional airmen who exemplified the highest traditions of military service, General Hawkins began. Captain Sarah Martinez and Lieutenant Jake Thompson gave their lives to save others, demonstrating the selfless courage that has always been the hallmark of American military aviation. The general went on to describe the tactical situation that Phoenix and Viper had faced, explaining to the civilian audience the complexity and danger of close air support missions in mountainous terrain. She emphasized how the two pilots had worked together seamlessly, each trusting the other completely as they flew through intense enemy fire to protect soldiers on ground. But this ceremony is not just about military tactics or strategic objectives, General Hawkins continued. It's about the human spirit, about people who chose to put the lives of others before their own safety. Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Thompson knew the risks they were taking, but they never hesitated to do what was right. Marcus was then called forward to address the gathering. As he walked to the podium, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, all of them looking to him for some insight into the events that had taken 2 lives while saving 4 others. He had prepared remarks, but standing before Phoenix's family and community, he decided to speak from the heart instead. 6 months ago, I had never met Sarah Martinez or Jake Thompson. Marcus began. They were voices on the radio, call signs in the sky above a valley where my team was fighting for our lives. But in the space of 30 minutes, they became the most important people in my world because they chose to risk everything to save strangers. Marcus paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. He could see Phoenix's parents in the front row, their expressions a mixture of pride and grief that he had come to recognize among military families. Near them sat Jessica Thompson, gently explaining something to her young daughter who was trying to understand why everyone was so serious. I've spent my entire adult life as a professional soldier, Marcus continued. I've served in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, working with some of the most capable and courageous people in our military. But I've never encountered the kind of selfless heroism that Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Thompson displayed that day. He went on to describe the tactical situation in detail, helping the civilian audience understand just how desperate things had become for Slate 12 before the A-10s arrived. Marcus painted a picture of 4 soldiers facing overwhelming odds, surrounded by an enemy that had planned their ambush carefully and was closing in for the kill. When Captain Martinez saw that missile heading for her wingman's aircraft, she had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision, Marcus explained. She could have continued her attack on the enemy positions threatening my team, or she could sacrifice her own life to save Lieutenant Thompson. She chose to save her fellow pilot without hesitation. Marcus's voice grew quieter as he approached the most emotional part of his story. And when Lieutenant Thompson found himself alone, facing multiple surface-to-air missile sites and dozens of enemy fighters, he had the same choice. He could have withdrawn to safety and waited for reinforcements, or he could press the attack knowing it would cost him his life. He chose to complete the mission. The gymnasium was completely silent as Marcus finished his account. Even Emma Thompson seemed to understand that something monumentally important was being discussed, and she sat perfectly still on her mother's lap, her large eyes focused on the man at the podium. "But I want to tell you something else," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "The sacrifice that Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Thompson made wasn't wasted. The 4 members of Slate 12 who came home from that valley have gone on to live productive lives, to contribute to their communities, and to raise families. Their children will grow up knowing that their fathers are alive because 2 pilots chose to die for strangers." Marcus then introduced the other members of his former team, who had all attended the ceremony despite being scattered across the country. Sergeant Williams had returned to his home in Ohio and was working as a police officer, using the tactical skills he had learned in the military to protect his community. Corporal Jackson had enrolled in college on a GI Bill and was studying to become a teacher. Specialist Chun had started a small business in California, hiring other veterans and giving them opportunities to succeed in civilian life. Each of these men carries the memory of Phoenix and Viper with them every day, Marcus explained. Their success in civilian life is a living testament to the value of the sacrifice that was made for them. The ceremony continued with musical tributes and additional speakers, but Marcus found his attention drawn to the interactions between Phoenix's family and the other military personnel present. He watched Robert Martinez speaking intently with a young Air Force captain, perhaps someone who had served with his daughter. He saw Elena Martinez hugging Jessica Thompson, 2 mothers bound together by their shared loss and their mutual understanding of military service. Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise guest arrived. Colonel Michael Hammer Harrison, Phoenix, and Viper's squadron commander, had flown in from Afghanistan to personally deliver their posthumous awards. As he approached the podium, Marcus could see the toll that losing 2 of his pilots had taken on the older officer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Harrison began, "it is my honor to present the Distinguished Flying Cross to the families of Captain Sarah Martinez and Lieutenant Jake Thompson. These awards are given for heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, and they are richly deserved." As Robert Martinez accepted his daughter's medal, Marcus could see the pride and pain warring in his expression. This piece of metal and ribbon represented official recognition of Sarah's heroism, but it could never bring her back or fill the void her death had left in their lives. Jessica Thompson accepted her husband's award with similar dignity, though Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly as she held the medal case. Emma seemed fascinated by the shiny metal and ribbon, reaching out to touch it gently, while her mother whispered explanations about why Daddy had received such a special honor. The ceremony concluded with a final tribute, the Missing Man Formation flyover. 4 A-10s from the same squadron where Phoenix and Viper had served approach from the south, flying in perfect formation at low altitude. As they passed over the school, one aircraft suddenly climbed steeply and broke away from the formation, symbolically representing the fallen pilots who would never return to their squadron. As the sound of jet engines faded in the distance, Marcus found himself surrounded by family members and fellow service personnel, all of them sharing stories and memories of the 2 pilots who had given their lives 6 months earlier. The conversations were intense, but therapeutic, allowing everyone present to process their grief in the company of others who understood the unique nature of military sacrifice. Later that evening, Marcus found himself sitting on the front porch of a local diner with David Martinez and Jessica Thompson, watching Emma play on a small playground nearby. The memorial service had been emotionally exhausting for all of them, but it had also provided a sense of closure that had been missing since the incident. "Do you think they knew?" Jessica asked quietly, watching her daughter slide down a small slide with delighted laughter. "Do you think Sarah and Jake understood what their sacrifice would mean to all of us?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Over the past 6 months, he had thought about this many times, wondering if Phoenix and Viper had fully comprehended the impact their actions would have on so many lives. "I think they understood their duty," he said finally. "I think they knew that leaving fellow warriors behind was not an option, regardless of the personal cost. Beyond that," Marcus shrugged, "I think they acted on instinct and training and the bonds that connect all military personnel." David nodded slowly. "Sarah always said that military service was about being part of something bigger than yourself. She said it was about accepting responsibility for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Jake felt the same way, Jessica added. "He used to tell Emma bedtime stories about brave knights who rescued people in distress. I think he saw himself as a modern version of those knights, using aircraft instead of horses and armor." As the evening wore on, Marcus realized that the memorial service had marked an important transition in his own healing process. For 6 months, he had struggled with guilt and survivor's syndrome, unable to move forward with his life while carrying the weight of Phoenix and Viper's sacrifice. But today, surrounded by their families and fellow service members, he had finally begun to understand that honoring their memory meant living a life worthy of their sacrifice. The next morning, Marcus drove to the small cemetery outside Cedar Ridge where Sarah Martinez had been laid to rest. Her gravestone was simple but dignified. Her name, rank, dates of birth and death, and the words she gave all for others. Fresh flowers had been placed there recently, probably by her parents who visited regularly. Marcus knelt beside the grave and placed his own tribute, a small American flag and a handwritten letter explaining how her sacrifice had changed his life and the lives of his teammates. As he stood to leave, he made a silent promise that he would continue working to help other veterans, that he would use his remaining years to serve his community in ways that honored the memory of two exceptional pilots. 6 months later, Marcus opened a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping veterans transition to civilian life. He named it the Phoenix Foundation, and its logo incorporated the call signs of both pilots who had saved his life. The foundation provided job training, counseling services, and financial assistance to veterans struggling with the challenges of leaving military service. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but Marcus approached it with the same dedication that Phoenix and Viper had shown during their final mission. Every veteran who found meaningful employment, every family that avoided homelessness, every former service member who successfully battled addiction was a small victory that helped justify the sacrifice made in an Afghan valley. Years passed, and Marcus's organization grew, helping thousands of veterans across the country. He often spoke at military ceremonies and veterans events, always ending his presentations with the story of two pilots who had chosen death over abandoning their fellow warriors. The story never failed to move his audiences, and it served as a powerful reminder of the values that bound the military community together. And in a small town in Texas, the families of Phoenix and Viper continued their own journeys of healing and remembrance, knowing that their loved one's legacy lived on in the lives they had saved and the example they had set for future generations of warriors.